I am Patricia Ferrieri. I am a full professor in two departments, in pediatrics first, where I became full professor in 1979, and I'm professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology as well. I came to the university in 1965 as an intern. We were not called PL1s at that time, as we weren't called residents, but and I had all of my career here, my training. After residency, I spent a 3-year, very research-oriented, bench-oriented fellowship in pediatric infectious diseases, and then joined the faculty and never left.
And we have always loved having you for all of those years.
Thank you.
My first question is where and when did you start your training? Before your residency, where did you
Yes.
medical school?
I went to medical school at the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Minnesota was one of my top choices for residency, and that's where I matched.
And then you said you did both your residency and your fellowship here at the University of Minnesota?
That is correct.
Perfect. And I guess one of my questions for you, I know you kind of straddle both worlds, as you mentioned. You said you did your fellowship in ID. How did you also get into the laboratory medicine world?
Well, I had great ties with an earlier professor and head of the microbiology laboratory here. He was also trained as a pediatric ID physician elsewhere and joined our faculty here as head of the laboratory. And so we shared a research lab for some years before he left to go to the University of Utah. And so I was very bench oriented because my fellowship included not only clinical work, but basic bench research and microbiology issues that I can either elaborate on more or later, but very streptococcal oriented research. And so as a third-year chief resident in peds, I did, a couple of months rotation in the microbiology laboratory, working on the benches, was involved in a project as a senior resident that I did in the evenings here in the microbiology lab. So I found when the opportunity came in 1982 to apply for the position as head of the microbiology laboratory, I felt very comfortable because my bench research in ID oriented me to microbiology and immunology. And that deepened over the years to embrace molecular research in my research laboratory that enabled me to rise to the challenges needed to lead the laboratory over the many years that I've been here. I continued to attend on PEDS ID until about 4 years ago, when my responsibilities were too great in the micro lab in the Department of Lab Medicine and Pathology, where I have a lot of administrative responsibilities as well. But there was a 15-month period where I was the acting division head in 1995, approximately, after Dr. Giebink, who had been head of the division, died. And I was on the search committee for a permanent replacement, but stepped up to the plate and was the acting division head then for 15 months before we recruited Dr. Mark Schleiss as the permanent head, which he held for several years until more recently. And so my comfort level was very great because I was grounded in basics of microbiology and immunology from fellowship, and continued that in my bench research.
And can you tell me, your official title is the director? Are you the director of the entire lab or the micro lab? What is that title?
It's called IDDL, the Infectious Diseases Diagnostic Laboratory. I'm the medical director. Fairview owns the University Hospital, and the technologists are Fairview employees. I am a university and medical school employee, but I've been able to make it work since 1982 and feel very comfortable with that relationship. But my title is Professor of Pediatrics, Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases. That's my secondary title from the medical school definition of you're only being able to hold one primary department. And I'm professor of laboratory medicine and pathology, where I hold an endowed chair that's known as the department head. I'd have to look at my signage as the department head professorship in laboratory medicine. The chairs, it's a chair that has the department chairman as part of the title, but without his name, professor. So I'm an endowed professor in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology.
You mentioned a mentor early in your training who helped you kind of along that path. I guess, what was his name, and what were some other important mentors that you've had along the way?
Well, I had several mentors, and one of them was my mentor for fellowship, the late Dr. Lewis Wanamaker, who was an incredible mentor. And I still think of him and all of the editing he would do of my manuscripts in red ink. And it looked as if someone had had a nosebleed on my writings, my typed papers. And I would put them in a drawer and keep them there for a day or two before I could face up to it. But I do the same thing with people who write papers with me. I edit them in red ink, mimicking my mentor's habits. And they don't look like a nosebleed, however. So he was very critical, but I got to know, he died tragically in 1989, at approximate age of 59, before his 60th birthday. But another mentor of mine, earlier than Dr. Wanamaker, is Dr. Paul Quee, who's now 97 years of age, and we communicate by email. But he was at one time the acting head of the microbiology laboratory. So I had a pediatric mentor from my residency who also had a role in the microbiology lab. And so I didn't find that alien. And then he recruited the late Dr. John Matson, who became another mentor for me in diagnostic microbiology. And I also spent 3 months at the University of Utah, where Dr. Matson was based as the department chair of pathology and the head of the microbiology lab. After I took on this position as head of the laboratory here at the University of Minnesota, I went and did a refresher for 3 months in a place where I felt comfortable and knew him. And it was a good brush-up course that permitted me to feel very comfortable as well, coming back here then. So those were my 3 major mentors here at the University of Minnesota. They were great mentors for me clinically as well, because they both were Dr. Wanamaker and Dr. Quee were superb clinicians and held that as a very important role when they were involved in patient care. This meant a great deal to both of them. I had another major 2 mentors in medical school who were pediatricians. One was the head of the department, and the other was a supreme diagnostic master, if you will, of all of pediatrics. And he was very special to me because he was frequently in the hospital until very, very late at night. And I, as a student, could meet with him and discuss patients, and he was there for backup. So that was very precious for me to have those other role models from medical school pediatric rotations.
And then I'm going to turn the question around a little bit. Who are, I know that you've been a mentor to many faculty members over the years. Who are some of the mentees that stand out to you that you've mentored over the years?
Well, I had several whom I mentored in pediatric infectious diseases. And ironically, a couple of them are retired. I'm not retired and don't have a retirement plan, but Dr. Bob Bortolucci, who's from Nova Scotia, and attained professorship there, is one of mine, and we worked on animal models of E. coli sepsis meningitis in the infant rat model. Janet Gilsdorf, took a position at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and became full professor there and head of the division. And she and I worked on Haemophilus influenzae type B meningitis in an infant rat model. So that stands out. Dr. Scott Halperin, Halperin, I may have misspelled it, but he's also at the University of Nova Scotia at the I.W. Killam Hospital, where he has done research on vaccines and specifically on Bordetella pertussis. So I mentored him and inherited him after Dr. Wanamaker died. And so he was very special and continues to be very special. Dr. David Speart, he may be retired at the University of Vancouver in Canada. He worked on various projects after Dr. Wanamaker died. I also did some mentoring with him. And so those are the ones that stand out. And I also have some international scientists who came that I mentored. I won't go into it. One was from Turkey originally, but came to me by a colleague in Germany. And then as well, Dr. Sasha Suvorov from St. Petersburg, Russia, came and spent a sabbatical year with me and did molecular research with me on some proteins of streptococci. And so there have been others over the years as well, but I can't say that I was there necessarily just the primary mentor. For some of them, it was not for research, but mentoring them from a clinical perspective. And one of them is Dr. Nadia Sam Ogadou, who we are trying to recruit to a faculty position right now in our division of pediatric infectious diseases. So many of them are very special for me because we established great bonds, seeing patients together, my acting as a sounding board for their career goals and options. And so there are many like that all over the country and all over the world in some cases.
A great legacy to have all those amazing people all over the world who you've mentored.
Well, some of the people you'll be interviewing, I've known since they were residents, and Dr. Blanche Chavers is one of them. And I feel very connected with Blanche and have a very high opinion of her.
She has a wonderful life story, and with a great interview. I personally really enjoyed talking to her this morning. When do you feel like you kind of had made it in your career?
Well, I don't feel I've ever made it necessarily. I never looked at my career in that way and sat back and said, well, now I'm a full professor, and isn't that marvelous? I don't feel, if I might call you Christina and Jack, I never looked at my career that way because I felt I was continuing to learn so many new things, and I feel that I only know a tiny slice of all of the world that I work in, and feel that we know maybe 10% of all there is to know in infectious diseases and research. And so I can't say that I've ever felt that I made it, that I have made it. That may seem curious to you, but I'm a very stern critic of myself, and I like to learn new things and delve into new aspects of my research work on group B strep and continue to learn new things. And I don't think that most of us don't think of ourselves as having arrived. Maybe I'm out in left field somewhere, but it's been a great journey. But I'm in awe of people who are continuing on in work that I have done and have goals that have not yet happened nationally or internationally for my favorite organism. And that is to hopefully, while I'm still alive, there will be a group B streptococcal vaccine for women that will permit us to decrease the morbidity and mortality of early and late onset group B strep in babies, and also contribute to the health of the elderly, because older people are very susceptible to group B strep sepsis as well. That has not happened yet, and COVID has put a damper in the United States on the advancement of group B streptococcal vaccine. Even though we were making great progress, I feel it's on hold at the moment. And COVID can be pinpointed for that lapse.
And so it sounds like your research and your career has really been focused on the group B strep.
Yes, and also on the group A strep to a certain extent, but the majority of it has been on group B strep. I started with group A strep work looking at what are known as bacteriophages of group A streptococci, sort of the equivalent of bacterial viruses. And I loved the work and I loved group A strep, but I had once thought many years ago that maybe I would do a neonatology fellowship after I did my pediatric ID fellowship. And I became so immersed in infectious diseases that I never strayed into neonatology, but I have a great commitment to it. And in a sense, veering off into group B strep at a young stage of my career helped me fulfill some of the goals that I had for working with neonates and neonatology. And as a faculty member, I attended for years on the level 1, level 2 nursery, and attended the deliveries of many high-risk women and worked with the perinatologists here at the University of Minnesota. And so it was very fulfilling. And so I never did my neonatal fellowship.
Well, group B strep, I mean, as a hospitalist who does a lot of nursery, I will say all that research on group B strep has definitely made a difference. It's a big topic still, and continues to be in the nursery world and the neonatal world. So that's a great place to have focused your research over the years. It's super important.
Well, I still get calls, and I also act as decision support for some of our junior faculty in Peds ID, and I contribute to our weekly meeting of the division where we discuss just patients on the wards. And I do antimicrobial stewardship with one of the Peds pharmacists, most notably in the past couple of years, all by remote, discussing essentially all the newborn, the ICU being the focus of our antimicrobial stewardship. We've branched out some to the older children's ICU, but the main focus has been the neonates. So I still get to dabble, if you will, in neonatology quite a bit, and get outside calls and review manuscripts and continue to write about group B strep. So it's a real challenge keeping up at times. As you know, there's such a huge literature and everything and I've had to keep up with COVID and all the microbiology issues here in the laboratory, bringing up new assays very, very frequently, and mastering the COVID assays as well, which has been a great thrill and challenge. I feel, well, I hope we won't have anything quite like COVID in our professional careers again. I'm hoping monkeypox will not achieve that status and embrace that number of patients. but it's been a very exciting period to be involved in COVID, I must tell you.
I think I remember hearing back in the beginning, you were really instrumental in helping us to have, I mean, we had some of the first testing here in the state.
Well, the first testing was done by someone from our human molecular diagnostics lab down the hall. And they brought it up over in the microbiology research facility across campus behind the stadium. And then we brought up commercial assays of several kinds that gave us the throughput to deal with it. And then off-site, the work done by one of my colleagues in lab medicine pathology was turned over to someone else and the team at Lab Medicine Pathology's advanced research laboratory that's over on Washington Avenue near Seven Corners. And so they brought up a home brewed assay that permitted them to do thousands a day, while we were maybe up to maybe closer to 3,000 a day ultimately in what we could do in the microbiology laboratory here in the East Bank Hospital. So we worked together a lot. We had, Zoom meetings, all of us involved in COVID on all sides of campus 3 times a week, ultimately down to, after a year or two, to twice a week, and now once a month. And we do all of the testing for all of Fairview, as we were responsible for from the beginning. And so the rates the numbers of tests have gone down, but the percent positivity is still very high. And many people are not represented in what we can talk about because they test at home now, and those are not recorded. And so we don't have a good feeling for the total numbers of positive people, but it's rather high. It's at least 12%, as you know.
Definitely.
And that number is increasing all over the country and in Minnesota in terms of the admissions to the hospital and the admissions to the ICU now. And flipping through some of our positives from the emergency room, I always zero in on ages, and they're young children, 1 and 2 years of age, who have very hot specimens. And that's very sad, makes me very sad. I'm hoping that we can advance the vaccine more in these young children where it's approved now. Excuse me a minute, where I pick up my eponymous pen, my red pen, where I finished final edits this morning of a paper that's very genomically oriented, but someday it will become more common to do these very sophisticated, fancy sequencing assays as part of routine care in the microbiology laboratory. Right now, only a few labs are really up and running with these deep kinds of sequencing assays. But that will be, again, a lot of these things have been put on hold in many areas of the country because of the COVID responsibilities that we have.
Why don't we talk about something other than COVID? Because I know that that's been the hot topic.
Talk about what?
Something other than COVID, because
Yes,
I know
I deal with that all
I'm
day.
sure you're tired of it. What are some of your favorite stories from your training and your career?
Well, I have wonderful memories of some of my patients, certainly. Some stand out even from an internship. You get very attached to your patients, in my opinion. And the program was quite different years and years ago. And we were very involved as interns and residents in running the show. And we wrote our orders, we conferred with our supervising resident. The attendings were more remote and came when we asked them to come for something special. And there was no billing for services during that era either until I became junior faculty. And so we had, we still were on call, I was on call every third night as an intern. And some of my memories are, I was always unlucky enough or lucky enough to be on call at night when catastrophes came in. Someone who had acute renal failure was in shock and needed dialysis. And at that time, we were allowed to go down and work with the dialysis technicians and the dialysis nurses. And I would go with my patients for the dialysis and sit through it, for a few of them at least, and would be the one to suggest what the electrolyte content would be of the dialysate, of the fluid that was being used. And I had great backup with the peds renal. I one time thought about doing peds renal actually as one of my great loves. And I had a wonderful mentorship from Dr. Alfred Michael. Dr. Alfie Fish started his fellowship here when I was an intern, and we worked together a lot also. But some of my favorite patients, and all these acute renal patients survived that I can think of. But it was a marvelous opportunity to learn so much about the kidney and to take care of children who were post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis with acute GN and shutdown, for example. These were among the patients I took care of. And other renal patients that, one of whom I became like a surrogate mother to because her parents did not come and visit at all. I became her doctor as an intern when she was X number of months of age, maybe 6 to 8 months of age. She had bilateral underdeveloped hypoplasia of her kidneys, and ultimately she needed dialysis, of course. So she was a challenge nutritionally. So I decided to fatten her up and had the support of peds renal and all the things I did. But these were special times here where you could have continuity of care of patients. Even when you left a unit, you could come back and be involved in their management. And in some cases, you would go to I would go to the specialty clinics as an intern and resident and follow up with the patients. But the ones I cited were very meaningful. And the tragedy of the baby with the hypoplastic kidneys, she grew to be, like a year and a half, 2 years of age, never grew much, and her intellectual development was very delayed. But I went out of town to a national peds research meeting, and they found a kidney for her. And the kidney was from an adult. And they transplanted it, and she died of pseudomonas sepsis. And that was very sad, but the chance didn't work. So there are many memories of that kind, but in general, they're positive, other than children who may have presented, for example, with a brain tumor. One of my favorite patients, Becky, came in when I was an intern, fell off her horse and on a farm and had a headache and had some neurological findings. But when we did scans, she had a midline tumor, and that it then ended ultimately in her demise. But there are patients like that you never forget. The other wonderful memories are of the collegiality, not only because we were smaller, we had a large, I was one of maybe 12 interns, which is smaller than what we have now, but we worked as teams, and I became a chief resident. There were only 2 of us left because everyone else went off to do their military service, perhaps, or other specialty work. So as a chief resident, I also made rounds on the wards. My co-chief and I took turns making rounds on various wards as if we were the attendings early in the morning. And we alternated and which units we made rounds on. And so we acted as faculty in a sense, as senior residents. I spent my senior residency year doing special electives, such as running our endocrine metabolic ward for a couple of months, did a peds renal elective as a 3rd year, and so on, various specialties, including, I may have done GI, I'm not sure of it. We were treated like fellows because there were very few post-residency fellows. And so as an intern, I did maybe a dozen liver biopsies under supervision, if you can believe it. Every child who came in with CF, newly diagnosed CF, had a liver biopsy done. I was not the one justifying it for the research purposes, but they had permission, obviously. And the late Dr. Harvey Sharp was my mentor for much of that, for most of my biopsies. And I did a dozen kidney biopsies when I was a senior resident doing the renal rotation. And I stopped at a dozen and I only had one mishap. We didn't do them under visualization, if you can imagine. We had a flat plate of the kidney. We outlined and percussed the kidney, and then we did the biopsy. So things are quite different now, as you know. There was one child who had hematuria following the biopsy, but no harm was done. I was very upset, of course, but it was to be expected when you don't have the precise visualization. But he had full recovery. It was done for a purpose. He had chronic kidney disease, so the vessels of the kidney may not have been normal. The vascularization might not have been quite normal, but the bleed resolved. The kidney came back to normal size, and all was well. But the flavor of what I'm presenting lets you understand the relationship we had among our fellow residents, but the close relationship we had with selected faculty, and the absence of post-residency fellows led to our rising to a higher performance plane and higher expectations of us than would have been expected. There was no layer between us as residents and the faculty. As a junior faculty person, I admitted a baby of 2 weeks, the daughter of a surgeon and a nurse, and it was rule-out sepsis and airway problems. And she had only a coag negative staph in her blood that I treated her for, but she had cystic hygromas of the mediastinum that were impinging on her airway. And I followed her for throughout a very critical phase of a many, many months hospitalization that led to a couple of 12-hour surgeries to try to remove these. And we became very close, the parents and I, the child. And I followed her into her teen years, actually. But the opportunity to participate for years and years in the care of various patients, not just of this one, is very, very special to watch children grow up. So she has finished college, she's a teacher, and she's a young mother now. And they still send me, all the details of all the family members at Christmas. Her mother is the correspondent, and so I feel up to date on all of her siblings, their families, and so on. But this is very special, and you don't know Dr. Jack Foker, and an ENT surgeon. I'm blocking his name at the moment, but the three of us were so involved in this child with the cystic hygromas that when the parents had their last child, the boy was given our names. The three of us, our name, he became a Patrick among his names, his three names, because they wanted to honor us for the care of his the sister just above him in the family lineup. So that gives you some notion of how it may have been a lot easier back then to develop some of these relationships than it is now, because of the rotations, the going around the Twin Cities. As a resident, right after internship, I went to St. Paul Children's for 2 months, and I had a couple of months at Hennepin County, but otherwise, all of my rotations for the 3 years were here at the University Hospital. And so that gave me greater opportunity of doing continuity clinics and specialties and so on. And developing these relationships, which I treasure, both with the faculty and with my patients and their families.
That's just such a lovely and wonderful story. And I will say I've heard that from other faculty, and I think there is probably a lot. It's definitely different now in terms of training and the quickness and the duty hours and how much you have to switch around. What you mentioned,
I wanted to comment on one other thing to expand on what you just said. This morning near the mailbox, I ran into Sam Gupta. He spends about 50% of his time over here on the East Bank. And I said, you know, Sam, there's some of our residents who don't even know we exist over here on the East Bank. This is where the micro lab is in the East Bank. This is where our hospital used to be before we built our hospital across. Well, we had it first here, you know, a couple of floors in our big hospital here on the East Bank before we developed and built the Children's Hospital. He said, I said, I'm meeting with one of our new fellows in a couple of days, and she went to school here, so I think she'll know how to come to my office here on the second floor and meet me. But there are people who went to school outside. They don't know that we exist here, Christina.
Yes. Well, I was an intern when we made the move. So I did 6 months in the old hospital, and then we moved over to the new Children's Hospital.
Then you know what it was like, the crowdedness. You know, there were no single rooms. When the children's rooms were here in the Mayo building, when I started, of course, the single rooms, it was not air conditioned. And a single room on most units was air conditioned for someone who was dying. That's who got, or bleeding to death, you know, with needing platelets desperately, bleeding out of the nose, and so on, and needing a private room. But there were many, many hot summer nights that I remember during that period. Yeah, well, here in the Mayo building, we had our pediatric wards were Station 45. There was a ward down the hall that was more for older children, 46. They were all stacked up. So Station 35 was on the street level. One up was Station 45, right above it was 55. And across from 55 was 56 for children under 1 year of age. And then we had in the Heart Hospital, which you're familiar with on River Road, maybe, or maybe you're not, we had Station 301, and we had all children on that. It was a newer facility compared to all the old units here in the Mayo building. And it was, you know, very primitive in some ways and crowded and hot during summer months. But then when we built Unit J, which I still call Unit J, the East Bank University Hospital, we had our pediatric floors, parts of floors and so on that were, again, somewhat stacked, but still not at the level of being what a first-class hospital should be in terms of the privacy issues for our children and their families. There weren't many amenities. And so now we have the extreme of having huge rooms for our children. But the advantage of being in a place like over here was that you mixed in the dining room, that there was a doctor's dining room. You mixed with surgeons and you mixed with internists. And because our departments were smaller, even at a very young age, I knew the associate dean who was a plastic surgeon, Dr. Sullivan, for example. I got to know his wife and his 2 sons and so on as adults. And the intimacy was very different. In Unit J, where we had our next modern facility, again, in the hallways and everywhere in the cafeteria, we mixed with faculty and doctors of many different specialties. There was, again, more intimacy. in Masonic Children's Hospital, I can recall attending on a Christmas Eve and walking the halls, and there was no one there. The nurses weren't there. There were very few patients. The intimacy is not there. And you don't encounter very many physicians of outside your own specialty even. So there's something to be lost when it's very big like that. You have to make the effort to seek out. On the intensive care units, it's different. They're in place. They're not mobile, the faculty and the house staff. And so that was always fun. I love intensive care patients and the neonatal intensive care as well. It's a different environment. We've improved our facility, but we've lost intimacy, in my opinion. I'm sorry, I interrupted the flow that you were going to develop.
Oh, no, this is perfect. No, you've kind of answered the question in a lot of ways. I was asking how the field of medicine, we've talked about a lot of the changes that you've seen over time. I was going to ask if there's any other big change that stands out to you in medicine.
One of the biggest changes is in the gender diversity of our residency. I was the only woman in residency for 3 years, probably. For 2 years, and then Carolyn Levitt, who developed her specialty over at St. Paul Children's in child abuse, was an intern when I was a chief resident. My 3rd year, she was the only woman intern. And so I became the first woman professor probably in the medical school in 1979. And now it's so wonderful that, you know, I belong to a PEDS book club, and you have to be director. They're all directors of something. They're primarily directors of divisions. There is someone who's director of PEDS radiology. Kathy Vendel decided because I'm a director of the microbiology lab, that I qualified for our book club. And it's been wonderful to relate to all these leaders in pediatrics. So the face of pediatrics, of academic pediatrics and private practice of pediatrics has changed, is the most dramatic change other than our technological advances in all fields. And that has been the most thrilling thing. And it's taken for granted, you see. And so you didn't ask me, how was it back then? Was it easy? No, it wasn't easy at all. And you became tough-skinned and thick-skinned and tough in having to fight your way and defend yourself, defend your actions, defend what you wanted to do, what was the correct thing to do medically. And it had its positives, but it was new to me because as a student, junior and senior student on the wards at the University of Pittsburgh and then the Children's Hospital, I hadn't perceived that the atmosphere was different. And I thought it was a little more, it was more negative here in some ways, but you know, you learn to hold your own.
Absolutely.
But we know that, you know, there are men now who think they invented us leaders in clinical pediatrics or academic pediatrics. They invented us.
No comment on that, I guess.
I don't think you should comment on that.
I won't. What advice? So a question is what advice you'd have for the next generation, and maybe I'll ask specifically for women in medicine. Any particular advice for us?
Well, I think it has many challenges, and I admire enormously, even back when beyond, there were women who juggled having a family and an academic career. It wasn't easy, and there were women who had to drop out because they weren't mentored in a way that permitted them to have a balance. I think it's a little easier now to balance things, but I still know women who have had to decrease their academic goals, still on faculty, but have a more clinically oriented, educational oriented profession, which is wonderful because many of these people and women and men bring uh, are wonderful in all areas, the so-called triple threat. But I still think that it's more challenging for women to succeed and advance without great support in the home, and think that they have to fight very hard for this opportunity and to have division of responsibilities, whether it's a female household, a male household, or a female male household. I think that there are great challenges, and I want to encourage women never to give up if their goals are to become academicians. It may take longer, but not to be discouraged. And the most important thing is having the right mentors. Mentoring is one of my favorite things, and I have mentored many, many residents and faculty members who are not in my field, but I've mentored many people up through promotion to associate professor, and then it's not thought that they need a mentor. Well, we all need a mentor. I would like to have a mentor even now. I do have someone I report to, but it's not the same thing as choosing a mentor that you feel you can talk about everything with. And so my co-faculty equal are the people I best like to discuss challenges with, because they understand what we go through. But I think that having a mentor, as long as one can possibly have one, if one is interested in going the academic route, if one wants to go up through the clinician educator route and be promoted, you still need to have mentors who believe in you and want you to succeed and who egg you on. Dr. Janet Gilsdorf, when she finished her 3-year fellowship, she said, I might go in to join Health Partners. I said, over my dead body. I said, I haven't spent 3 years mentoring you, the agony of writing all these papers and everything. That's not for you. You have a different track ahead of you. And so she got a job at the University of Michigan. Her husband was a surgeon who went to the VA. He was not on the same academic track. And she became known as a leader in her field. And she's retired, but she writes books that are not about science, but she is active in the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Society and has mentored some wonderful people herself. And you can say, well, that was a terrible thing to say. No, if I thought she was an excellent clinician, if she wanted to do that, that was fine. But she didn't have the confidence in herself to think that she would be acceptable or would find an appropriate position. And so one must dream big, is my advice. Dream big. Do not give up your dreams.
That's really good advice.
Have a mentor who believes in you for as long as you can keep one.
I think that's all really, really excellent advice. I think for all of us who are early in our career and also early in our families, as you mentioned, and trying to balance all of those things, it's definitely we take all the help we can get. I know that I do, at least.
Well, that's great. I don't have any children of my own, but I always say I have thousands of children that have been part of my life.